More often than not, when we check out pre-built gaming desktops here at Kit Guru, they've been designed to extract the most performance at a given price point, be that 1,500 quid, 2 grand, whatever it may be. Well, this is the Warp Nova R from PCSpecialist, and this system has been designed from the get-go with aesthetics and looks mostly in mind. That doesn't mean it isn't packing some power though. It's got a Ryzen 7 7800X3D and an RTX 4070 Super inside. Let's run it through our usual suite of benchmarks, see how it does, and I'll give you my thoughts on how it performs and how it looks. Hi guys, I'm Matt and welcome to Kit Guru. So this on the desk behind me is the Warp Nova R. It sounds like something out of an episode of Star Trek. Picking one of these systems up is going to cost you 2 grand. That's £2,000. That converts roughly to $2,500 or 2,360 euros, there or thereabouts. It comes back to the PCSpecialist's 3-year standard warranty, which can be upgraded to their platinum tier for an extra cost to cover pretty much everything for the full 3 years. And before we dive into the spec on show today, I'll just mention that you can pick and choose different parts and stuff if you want to, and should you ever decide to order anything from PCSpecialist. And with that out of the way, let's run through the spec that we've got to play with in the system that I'm looking at today. The CPU is the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, probably the best pound for pound gaming CPU you can get at the moment. It's got 8 cores and 16 threads running at a base clock speed of 4.2 GHz and boosting up to a maximum of 5 GHz. It runs on a TDP of 120 watts and it of course has AMD's 3D cache, which helps pretty substantially in gaming scenarios, as can be seen in Leo's review of the CPU itself from last year. That CPU is sitting in a GIGABYTE B650M DS3H micro ATX motherboard. A small form factor board to fit with the case that I'm going to talk about in a minute. This is a relatively simple motherboard that kind of serves its purpose in the spec list. It's got 2 onboard M.2 slots, although neither of them support PCI Express Gen 5. The VRM and M.2 heatsinks look pretty substantial, and their design gives the board a bit of a gamer vibe. It's got a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port on the back, but then it lacks Wi-Fi. Rear I/O is decent. It's got 4 USB 2.0 Type A ports, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A port, a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port. Then it's got a PS2 port from back in the day, 2 display ports, 1 HDMI. It's got Q flash, allowing you to flash the BIOS without having a CPU installed. That'll come in handy if you ever upgrade to one that needs a new BIOS and you don't have your old one. Then there's the 2.5 gigabit LAN port that I mentioned a second ago, and finally some audio jacks. Like I said, it is a board that serves its purpose really. It looks pretty nice in its defence, although it is missing some nice to have specs from the capabilities of the AM5 platform. One small plus point is that it was running the latest BIOS version when it arrived for review to me, and that BIOS is from May of this year. I'm not sure if PCSpecialist updated it or if it came like that from the factory, but either way, it's nice to see and it's one less thing for customers to do. The graphics card is the ASUS TUF GeForce RTX 4070 Super OC edition. A card with 12GB of GDDR6X memory running across a 192-bit interface at 21 gigabits per second. It's got all the bells and whistles we're now used to seeing with 4000 series NVIDIA cards like DLSS 3, frame generation, 3rd generation ray tracing cores. It's a triple fan card with ASUS's Axial Tech dual bearing fans. It's also got dual BIOS on board, performance and quiet modes, which are selectable with a switch on the side of the card. When I ran GPU-Z, it read the base clock speed at 1980 MHz with a boost speed of 2565 MHz. Memory comes in the form of a 32GB kit of Corsair Vengeance DDR5. It's running at 6000 megatransfers and has got CL40 timing, and the whole kit consists of 2 16GB modules. Expo was enabled in BIOS by PCSpecialist when it arrived with me, so I didn't have to turn that on. So with that, coupled with the fact that they're using 6000 megatransfers memory, leaves me with nothing to complain about in regards to the RAM in this system. Storing everything is a 2TB SOLIDIGM P44 Pro M.2 NVMe Gen 4 SSD. Specs list this drive as having a read speed of 7,000 megabytes per second and a write speed of 6,500 megabytes per second, and that was confirmed and even exceeded a bit by my tests with Crystal Diskmark. I'm glad to see a 2TB drive being used, as I just don't feel that 1TB is enough for a gaming PC in 2024. Especially if you're a bit of a game hopper like I am. Powering everything is a Corsair 750W RME series power supply. This is a fully modular unit with native 12V high power support and an 80+ gold power efficiency rating. And then moving on to the cooler then, keeping the CPU cool is one of Corsair's latest offerings, the ICUE Link H100i ARGB AIO. This is a 240mm cooler which includes two of their QX120 fans on the radiator. It's got as much RGB as Blackpool illuminations, and it is, as the name suggests, part of Corsair's Link system, which simplifies building by connecting cooling components and fans and stuff with a single cable. Something which me and Leo first saw back at Computex 2023, so last year, not the one that's just been. Then housing all of that stuff is a black Corsair 2500X Micro ATX dual chamber case. It's got an ever popular fish tank style design. What it lacks in height, it more than makes up for with its width. Although it's a micro ATX case, it's still quite chunky. It kind of has to be to hide the PSU away inside of the second chamber. Front I/O is pretty standard. Alongside the power and reset buttons, there's a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port, a pair of USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type-A ports, and then a combo audio jack. And talking about additional cooling then, bringing in some cool air directly to the GPU, there's a single 120mm PCSpecialist fan installed in the floor of the case, directly underneath the fans of the 4070 Super. Then finally, in addition to the QX120 fans on the radiator as part of the cooler, there's another 3 of them installed as case, intake and exhaust fans, 2 as intake on the front/side section, and then 1 as exhaust in the back of the case. These fans are not your standard 120mm case fans, and to be fair, they cost like 140 quid for a triple pack, so I'd almost expect them to be able to make me a brew. Unfortunately, they can't do that, but they do have a temperature sensor and an MCU built into each fan, something which me and Leo first saw at Computex as well, along with the rest of the ICUE Link stuff. You can control these fans individually and control their RPMs individually, and you can dial in your case cooling on a fan by fan basis to react to any sort of hot spots that might be occurring. And being Corsair, they're absolutely stacked with RGB. Which brings me on nicely to talk about the design, the aesthetics, and the system's kind of bling factor. As I mentioned at the start of the video, when I was first contacted about reviewing this system, it was described to me as focusing on aesthetics and design, which to a certain extent, I have to say that PCSpecialist have delivered. The QX120 fans have one of my favourite RGB implementations of any fan I've ever seen. Corsair have really got their RGB feature set dialed in, and they've really pushed it forward with some of their latest releases. The fans have all of the usual modes that we're used to seeing from Corsair. The RGB is diffused excellently as well, and they've got a dual-sided design, so you'll get to enjoy the RGB no matter which way around they are. But that's nothing new, and it's a feature we've seen on loads of other fans in the past, and a feature which kind of been surpassed now by fans that have got reversible blades. The mode that really delivered on the design front for me though is Time Warp. The Corsair fans have the option to freeze the fan blades using synchronized lighting. The fans are still operating as they normally would. They're still spinning, but they look like they're either stopped or spinning much more slowly. It looks very cool, and it's eye-catching when you see a system with the fans lit up in this way. Aside from that though, there are a few areas where I think the system falls short on the design front. The memory for one jumped out at me isn't RGB, which I was genuinely shocked to see when considering the other parts on the spec sheet and that make up the system. That plain black fan as well at the very bottom of the case stands out a bit, and it looks very cheap when compared to the Corsair offerings found everywhere else. Then there's the standard power supply cables, which I feel should have been custom cables to really bring the look of the system together. It's the little details that give a PC the wow factor, and if it were me buying a system while having design near the top of the list of my priorities, I'd kind of want that sort of stuff to have been thought about by the person speccing it out or the company speccing it out. Before moving on to look at how this PC performs then, I'll just mention that the only things I've had to do to the Warp Nova R before testing was to update the graphics card driver. For some reason it had studio drivers installed out of the box. I removed those with DDU and installed a fresh copy of the latest NVIDIA Game Ready drivers. Not that the studio drivers would have made a massive difference to performance, but most gamers are going to be using the Game Ready drivers, so that's what I went with too. Aside from that, I've updated Windows like I usually do and done nothing else to the system. Right, let's look at how this system performs, shall we? Kicking things off with Cinebench Multicore then, and the 7800X3D found in the Warp Nova R recorded a result of 17,440 points, putting it a bit of a distance behind the same processor that was found in the last system I reviewed from CyberPower PC. Power usage was also lower on the PCSpecialist system though, with the processor found in this machine reaching a peak of 77 watts when boosting to 5.8 GHz. Clock speeds during this benchmark stuck around the 4.6 GHz mark most of the time, aside from when it was boosting, and there was no thermal throttling indicated in hardware info. Moving on to look at single core performance while sticking in Cinebench then, and the chart paints an almost identical picture, a lower score and a lower power usage when compared to the same chip in a different system. 3D Mark TimeSpy then, and the chart here is sorted by GPU score, and the Warp Nova R lands in the middle of the table. The CPU result measuring the performance of the 7800X3D expectedly didn't blow me away. This CPU shines in gaming scenarios and it's well known to fall short on synthetic benchmarks like this one. The GPU score of 20,603 points is close enough to the other 4070 Super on the list to be placed within margin of error, with a difference of just 21 points. The memory found in the Warp Nova R, a 32GB kit of Corsair Vengeance CL40 running at 6,000 megatransfers, just to repeat that from earlier. It recorded read speeds of 59,160 megabytes per second in our AIDA64 benchmark, while the same test resulted in write speeds of 79,889 megabytes per second. And the last of my synthetic benchmark tests then, PC Mark 10, shows that just as expected, the Warp Nova R is a system that is much more than capable of everyday tasks and computing, as was expected really. While not the best machine for editing and creative work, it will easily handle some light content creation or productivity focused workloads alongside the lengthy gaming sessions for which most of the parts were designed. Looking at gaming then, and I'll kick things off with Cyberpunk 2077. And at 1440p I saw average FPS readings of 80 with a 1% low of 63.4, while at 4K those figures dropped down to 35.6 average and a 28.4 1% low. Moving on to Assassin's Creed then, and at 1440p that figure jumps up to 124.8 FPS at 1440p with a 94.81% low. While at 4K that drops down to 78.6 average FPS, still a very respectable result at maximum settings, while the 1% low was recorded at 65.3. Company of Heroes then, a more CPU bound game to be fair, and at 1440p we saw the average FPS of 198.3 with a 1% low of 151.2. While at 4K that still remained a pretty respectable average FPS of 115.1 with a 1% low of 92.8. Shadow of the Tomb Raider then at 1440p maximum settings recorded an average FPS of 114.5 with a 1% low of 93.9. While at 4K average FPS was 60 exactly, while the 1% low was 52.6. F123 then, and at 1440p performance was on average 168.5 FPS with 151.81% low. And then at 4K the average FPS dropped down to 105.4 with a 1% low of 89.8. The 1% low figure at 1440p was particularly impressive. The 7800X3D processor is doing a good job with that. Moving on to the other racing game in the list then, Forza Motorsport, and at 1440p the average FPS was 116.5 with a 1% low of 86.5, while at 4K average FPS was 83.1 with a 1% low of 74.5. Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p then saw an average FPS reading of 92.2 with a 1% low of 50, while at 4K that average fell down to 48.4 FPS and the 1% low was just a touch below 30 at 29.7. The Witcher 3 then, and at 1440p with maximum settings saw average FPS of 78.1 with a 1% low of 62, while at 4K that again dipped down to 40.4 average FPS with a 1% low of 34.4. I played Tale Requiem then, and at 1440p average FPS was 77.2 with a 1% low of 67.2, which is a very similar result to The Witcher we looked at previously. While bumping this game up to 4K saw the average FPS come in at 41.6 with a 1% low reading of 36.6. Finally then, Starfield at 1440p saw average FPS figures of 71.9 with 1% low readings of 56.8, while bumping that up to 4K saw average FPS figures of 44.6 and a 1% low of 36.2. And then 10 game average FPS readings then to give you a better picture of the overall gaming performance of this system. At 1440p the average FPS across the 10 games that I tested was 112.2 with a 1% low figure of 87.8. While at 4K that average dropped to 65.3 with a 1% low reading of 54. If you're looking for a new chair, then you should definitely check out Boolies. I'm currently sat on their Ninja Pro gaming chair, which is one of 3 models from their gaming series alongside the Elite and the Master. So if you're looking for something new to stick in your setup that you can sit on and game and work, then I recommend definitely checking out boolies.co.uk. So there's the game performance then, and it's not much different to what I expected. The 4K figure being above 60 was impressive, and I don't know about you, but when I play games at 4K, it's usually single player games, and I don't really play competitive shooters at 4K. So I'm okay with being above 60 and getting real graphical fidelity at 4K and immersing myself in a good game, whereas I turn the resolution down or play on a different monitor for competitive stuff. So the gaming performance of this system is pretty good. Let's move on now and look at thermals, noise and power before wrapping up the video. Moving into looking at thermals, noise and power then, and CPU power consumption is markedly higher when running intensive tasks such as Cinebench, as the chart shows, with the 7800X3D hitting 77 watts when running through a multi-core workload. At idle, the CPU used just 24 watts, while when gaming in Cyberpunk 2077, that usage rose up to a still very conservative 45 watts. CPU package temperature reflects the power usage across the 3 scenarios that I tested. We do have to bear in mind that ambient temperatures in my office were roughly 22 degrees Celsius, thanks to a bit of a heat wave and a distinct lack of air conditioning here in the UK. With that being said, the CPU sat at 52 degrees when idle, with that figure rising to 68 degrees when gaming and 88 degrees when really pushing the CPU in Cinebench. GPU temperatures when running through a 30-minute Cyberpunk 2077 stress test with the same 22 degree ambient temperature was 65 degrees on the GPU and then 75 degrees on both the memory and the hotspot sensors. System noise was nothing crazy. The noise floor in my office is roughly 31 to 32 decibels, and while idling the Warp Nova R is pretty quiet to be honest, raising my sound meter by roughly 4 decibels. When gaming, this figure jumps up to 40 decibels as the graphics card and the CPU cooling begin to ramp up. Then finally, when pushing the CPU to its limit in Cinebench, the sound meter again increases up to 44 decibels. And last but not least then, total system power when measured at the wall socket was 106 watts when idle and then 342 watts when gaming, and the GPU started to get a bit thirsty while playing Cyberpunk 2077. Overall then, I have mixed feelings about this system. On one hand, I do think that PCSpecialist got some of the way there with their focus on design and aesthetics, but like I said earlier, the little finishing touches did let me down a little bit. The lack of RGB memory, when considering the RGB found everywhere else, was quite shocking, although the fact that it's 6,000 meg transfers did soften the blow a little bit. My underlying opinion on it is that a gamer that's looking for a system and having design pretty high up on the priority list is going to be less bothered about budget than, say, someone looking solely for the best performance for their money. Not that they're not going to appreciate value, but if the system is going to focus on looks and aesthetics, I think they'd be willing to spend a bit more to get the wow factor that I mentioned earlier. PCSpecialist should have gone all in on the design, but it instead feels like the Corsair ICUE link part and the Corsair case were added to the spec sheet, and that's where the focus kind of died off a little bit. Design wise, it's a good start, but it could be better. Pricing for having it pre-built isn't too bad. I priced up the same system minus the operating system license on PC Part Picker and it came out at roughly £1,880. Then you have to factor in the warranty and obtaining a copy of Windows if you need one. So the pricing is fair, as I've always found is the case with PCSpecialist, to be honest. But you're paying a premium for the Corsair cooler and the fans. As cool as they may be, they are on the expensive side when you compare them to alternatives. They definitely deliver on the design front though. The time warp setting on the fans looks very good in person, although it can be slightly twitchy at times. Performance wise, it performed about as expected. It was a little bit behind the last system that I looked at with this CPU, and it was about on par with a 4070 Super system that I've looked at in the past. So performance wise, it didn't really shock me, it didn't disappoint me. It's a decent gaming system. I think the Warp Nova R overall, it's a good looking and good performing PC, but with a few additions, it could be a great looking PC. And that's the end of the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like down below if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to Kit Guru to keep up with the latest PC gaming news and reviews. And if you go down below the video, you'll find links to our merch store for t-shirts and stuff like that. And then in the description, you'll find links to our Discord server, our Patreon page, and our website if you want to check any of that stuff out. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I've been Matt. That behind me on the desk has been the Warp Nova R pre-built desktop from PC Specialist. I will speak to you in the next one. Look after yourselves. See you later.